I click through another set of photos from last month's trip to the old Packard plant, adjusting the brightness on a shot of the main assembly floor. The image captured the decay perfectly. Rust-stained concrete, twisted metal beams, and shattered glass scattered across what had once been a bustling factory floor. 20 years of this, and I still found something satisfying about documenting these forgotten places. My fingers moved automatically through the familiar routine of uploading, tagging, and organizing. Each photo got a detailed caption noting the location, date, and any relevant historical context I'd researched beforehand. The blog itself remained completely private, password protected, and buried under a generic domain name that wouldn't attract attention. I'd learned early on that sharing exploration photos publicly just invited vandals and thrill seekers who had no respect for these places. The apartment felt too quiet around me, the way it always did when I got absorbed in cataloging my work. I'd moved here to Chicago 3 years ago, trading the suburban house that still carried too many memories for this efficiency unit downtown. The space was functional. A desk pushed against the window, a bed, a small kitchen I barely used. Most of my possessions were exploration gear: sturdy boots, flashlights, cameras, and the external hard drives that held thousands of photos spanning 2 decades. I paused at a photo from the Mercy General Hospital series, taken 2 weeks ago in Detroit. The image showed a long corridor on the 3rd floor, patient rooms branching off on either side. The afternoon light filtering through broken windows created interesting shadows along the walls, and the peeling paint gave the scene an almost artistic quality. Something about abandoned hospitals always drew me back. Maybe it was the way they represented both healing and decay, life and death existing in the same space. The grief counselor I'd seen briefly after Isabel's accident would probably have had thoughts about that connection. She'd suggested my exploration hobby was a way of processing loss, of finding beauty in places that had been left behind. I'd stopped seeing her after 3 sessions, but her words had stuck with me more than I cared to admit. My email notification chimed, pulling me away from the hospital photos. The message sat at the top of my inbox, sent to the contact form on my blog. Most messages I received were spam or people asking for location details I'd never share. This one was different. Subject: Your Detroit hospital photos. Incredible work. Hi, Michael. I've been following your exploration documentation for a while now, and I have to say your work is absolutely incredible. The level of detail and respect you show for these places is exactly what this community needs more of. I run a pretty popular exploration channel myself, and I'm always looking to connect with serious explorers who share the same passion for preserving these forgotten spaces. I'm particularly interested in your recent series from Mercy General Hospital in Detroit. There's something really unique about those photos, especially the ones from the 3rd floor. I've been studying them, and I think you've captured some elements that most people would miss completely. I have some techniques for bringing out what I call hidden elements in abandoned spaces, details that are there but not immediately visible.
I'd love to meet up and explore together sometime. I think we could learn a lot from each other, and I'd be happy to share some of the methods I've developed over the years. Would you be interested in revisiting Mercy General? I think there's still a lot more to discover there. Let me know if you'd be up for collaborating. I think we could create something really special together. Best regards, David Reed Urban Decay Chronicles. I read through the message twice, then clicked on the linked channel name. The site loaded to reveal a polished layout with professional quality photos and videos. David's content showed the same types of locations I explored: factories, schools, hospitals. But his presentation was slick, designed for maximum visual impact. His follower count was impressive, over 50,000 subscribers across various platforms. The guy clearly knew his way around abandoned buildings, and his photos showed technical skill I respected. But something about the tone of his message felt off. The way he mentioned hidden elements and claimed to see things in my photos that others would miss came across as unnecessarily mysterious. Most serious explorers I'd met were straightforward about their methods. I scrolled back through my Detroit hospital photos, looking for whatever David thought he'd spotted. The images looked the same as always, well-composed shots that captured the atmosphere without revealing the exact location. I'd been careful about that, shooting angles that showed the building's character without including identifying features that might draw unwanted visitors. His mention of the third-floor photos made me pause. Those had been taken during my second visit to Mercy General, when I'd finally worked up the nerve to explore beyond the ground floor. The upper levels felt different somehow, heavier with the weight of whatever had happened there over the decades. I'd moved through those corridors quickly, taking my shots and leaving without the usual lingering I did in other locations. The rational part of my brain said to ignore the message. 20 years of solo exploration had taught me to be cautious about reaching out to strangers, especially ones who contacted me first. I'd built my routine around solitude, finding peace in the quiet documentation of these places, without having to explain myself to anyone else. But David's enthusiasm reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. The excitement of sharing discoveries with someone who understood why these places mattered. I'd been alone with this hobby for so long that the idea of having a knowledgeable partner was more appealing than I wanted to admit. I found myself typing a response before I'd fully decided to send it. My fingers moved across the keyboard, composing something that sounded professional but not overly eager. I mentioned my interest in his techniques and agreed that Mercy General still had unexplored potential. By the time I finished writing, I'd committed to meeting him there the following Saturday. I hit send before I could change my mind. The message disappeared into my outbox, and I immediately felt a mix of anticipation and unease. I hadn't explored with anyone else since my early days, back when I was still learning the basics of urban photography. Those partnerships had never lasted long. Most people were more interested in the thrill than the documentation, or they'd get careless and damage something that should have been left untouched. David seemed different, though. His photos showed respect for the spaces he visited, and his technical knowledge appeared genuine. Maybe having someone else along would add something to the experience I'd been missing. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. Saturday was 5 days away, giving me time to research David's background and plan the logistics of returning to Detroit. Mercy General Hospital had been calling me back anyway. I'd felt like my last visit had barely scratched the surface of what the building contained. The decision was made, and for the first time in months, I found myself looking forward to an exploration with something beyond my usual quiet satisfaction. I pulled into the cracked parking lot of Mercy General Hospital, the familiar sight of broken windows and graffiti-covered brick doing nothing to calm the nerves I'd been fighting during the 3-hour drive from Chicago. The building looked exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks ago. 4 stories of medical equipment scattered across floors where nature had begun its slow reclamation project. What didn't look familiar was the bright red sports car parked near the main entrance. Its paint job so pristine, it might as well have been flashing a neon sign, advertising our presence to anyone in the neighborhood. I'd specifically mentioned in my reply to David that urban exploration required discretion, but apparently that message hadn't made it through. A guy stepped out from behind the car, and I immediately understood why his online presence felt so polished. David Reed looked like he'd walked off the set of some adventure reality show. Crisp cargo pants that had never seen actual dirt. A photographer's vest with more pockets than any human could possibly need, and boots so new they practically squeaked. His hair was styled in that deliberately messy way that took 20 minutes to achieve, and when he smiled, it had the practiced quality of someone used to being on camera. Michael.
Man, I can't tell you how excited I am about this. He bounded over with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever, extending a hand that felt soft against my calloused palm. I've been looking forward to this all week. Good to meet you in person, I said, keeping my voice neutral while taking in the expensive camera hanging around his neck and the metal case he was pulling from his trunk. Everything about David screamed money and inexperience, the kind of combination that usually led to broken equipment and damaged buildings. He hefted the case with both hands. The thing probably worth more than my car. I brought some specialized gear for today. Really excited to try out some new techniques I've been developing. I shouldered my worn backpack, feeling suddenly underdressed in my faded jeans and work boots. 20 years of exploration had taught me that the best gear was reliable gear, not the shiniest gear, but David clearly subscribed to a different philosophy. We walked toward the hospital entrance, and I immediately noticed David pulling out his camera. The click of the shutter came rapid fire, and I realized with growing irritation that he was photographing me without asking. "Documentation is key for any serious exploration," he said when he caught me looking. "I like to capture the whole experience, start to finish. My followers really appreciate that level of detail." "Maybe warn me next time before you start shooting," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. I don't really do the social media thing.
David lowered his camera with a look that suggested he couldn't quite compute what I'd just said. "Really? But your work is incredible. You could have thousands of followers if you opened up your blog. The engagement on urban exploration content is insane right now." I pushed through the gap in the chain-link fence that surrounded the hospital, checking automatically for any signs that the opening had been widened since my last visit. The metal still showed the same rust patterns, which meant we probably weren't dealing with regular traffic from other explorers or vandals. The main entrance hung open, the double doors twisted off their hinges and leaning against the wall like broken wings. I stepped carefully over the threshold, avoiding the broken glass that crunched under David's feet as he followed behind me with all the stealth of a marching band. "Wow, this place has incredible atmosphere," David said, his voice echoing through the empty lobby in a way that made me wince. "The natural lighting through those windows is perfect." I stopped and turned to face him. "You might want to keep your voice down. Sound carries in these buildings, and we don't know if anyone else is around." David waved dismissively. "I checked the area before you got here. We're totally alone." He was already raising his camera again, the flash going off as he captured shots of the reception desk and the corridors branching away from the main entrance. The flash made bright spots dance across my vision, and I felt my patience starting to slip. Every serious explorer knew that using flash drew attention and ruined the natural atmosphere of these places. The fact that David was firing it off like he was at a tourist attraction told me everything I needed to know about his actual experience level. We moved into the first floor corridor, and I watched David knock over a piece of fallen ceiling tile with his equipment case. The crash echoed through the hallway, and he didn't even pause to acknowledge what he'd done. "So I've been studying your photos pretty intensively," David said, setting down his case and opening it to reveal an array of cameras, lenses, and equipment I didn't recognize. "There are some really interesting elements in your compositions that I don't think you're aware of." He pulled out a manila folder and opened it to reveal printed copies of my Mercy General photos. Seeing my work in his hands felt wrong somehow, like he'd taken something private and made it his own. The photos were good quality prints, which meant he'd paid money to have them professionally produced. "Look at this one." He held up the image I'd taken of the third-floor corridor during my second visit. "See this shadowy area here, in the corner where the hallway turns?" I looked at the photo, seeing exactly what I'd captured 2 weeks ago: peeling paint, broken floor tiles, and the natural shadows created by afternoon light filtering through the windows. I see the corner, I said. There's more there than just shadows. David pulled out a magnifying glass and held it over the printed image. This is what I mean by residual presence. These old buildings, especially hospitals, they hold on to things. You've been documenting it without even realizing it. The magnifying glass revealed the same corner, maybe slightly grainier due to the enlargement, but nothing that looked like anything beyond normal photographic shadows and grain. I'm not seeing whatever you think you're seeing, I said. David looked at me with the kind of expression you'd give someone who couldn't understand basic math. That's because you haven't trained yourself to look for it yet. It takes practice to recognize the signs. He flipped through more of my photos, pointing to various shadowy areas and making claims about energy patterns and spiritual impressions that sounded like the kind of garbage paranormal investigators spouted on cable television shows. Each explanation made me more certain that agreeing to this collaboration had been a mistake. I think we should visit the exact spots where you took these photos, David continued. I want to use some specialized techniques to bring out what's really there. I watched him pack his equipment back into the case, noting how he handled everything with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had expensive gear stolen or broken during an exploration. His whole approach felt like performance rather than documentation, like he was more interested in creating content than understanding these places. The third floor is where I got the most interesting shots, I said, partly because it was true and partly because I wanted to see how David handled the more challenging parts of the building. The upper floors required careful navigation and real respect for structural integrity. Perfect. That's exactly where I want to start. As we moved toward the stairwell, David kept up a constant stream of chatter about his online following, his equipment, and his theories about what he called captured phenomena. He complained about other explorers stealing his techniques and mentioned lawsuits he was considering against people who'd used locations he'd discovered first. The building felt different today. Usually, Mercy General had a quiet, melancholy atmosphere that I found almost peaceful. With David's voice bouncing off the walls and his equipment clattering through the corridors, the place seemed to push back against our presence. The shadows looked darker. The silence between his words felt heavier, and I found myself walking faster, just to put some distance between us. I'd explored alone for so long that I'd forgotten how much another person could change the entire character of a place. David's presence turned what should have been a respectful documentation into something that felt more like invasion, and I started counting the hours until I could reasonably cut this collaboration short and return to Chicago. The hospital seemed to agree with my assessment, and as we climbed toward the upper floors, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mercy General was less welcoming today than it had ever been during my solo visits. The third floor felt different from the lower levels. David's voice carried farther here, bouncing off walls that seemed more solid than the crumbling plaster downstairs. I moved carefully along the corridor, testing each step before putting my full weight down. The floorboards creaked under us, and more than once I noticed gaps where sections had rotted away completely. David pulled out the manila folder again, spreading my printed photos across a windowsill like he was reading a treasure map. His finger traced the corridor in the images, comparing them to our actual surroundings with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "This intersection right here," he said, pointing to a spot where two hallways met. "This is exactly where I need to set up." I looked at the intersection he'd identified. It matched the location in one of my photos perfectly. The same peeling paint patterns on the walls, the same broken floor tiles, even the same afternoon light angle coming through the windows. David had studied my work with an attention to detail that felt invasive. He held up the printed photo, angling it so I could see what he was looking at. "Right there, in that corner where the shadows meet. See how dark it gets?" I stared at my own image,
seeing exactly what I'd captured 2 weeks ago. The corner was shadowy because that's what corners in abandoned buildings looked like when afternoon light hit them at specific angles. Basic photography. "I see shadows," I said. "No, look closer." David pulled out his magnifying glass again, holding it over the print. "The darkness doesn't match the light source. There's something there that shouldn't be there." I took the magnifying glass and examined the photo myself. The corner showed the same shadows I remembered taking, maybe slightly grainier under magnification, but nothing that suggested anything beyond normal photographic capture. "I'm not seeing whatever you think you're seeing," I repeated. David's expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. Part frustration, part excitement, like he was dealing with someone who couldn't grasp an obvious truth. "That's because you haven't developed the eye for it yet, but trust me, it's there." He started unpacking his equipment case, pulling out cameras and lenses with the enthusiasm of someone setting up for a professional shoot. The metallic clicks and whirs echoed through the corridor as he assembled his gear, completely ignoring the way sound traveled in these empty spaces. "David, you really need to keep it down," I said. "We don't know if—" "I've been tracking this particular manifestation for 2 years," he interrupted, attaching a telephoto lens to one of his cameras. "It shows up in photographs taken at specific locations, always in corner spaces, always in places where strong emotional events occurred." He positioned his equipment to face the intersection, adjusting angles and checking light readings with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before. His movements had a practiced quality that didn't match the amateur enthusiasm he'd shown downstairs. "What exactly do you think you're going to photograph?" I asked. "Residual energy, spiritual imprints. Call it whatever you want, but it's real, and it's been hiding in plain sight in photos like yours for years." David raised his camera, pointing it toward the corner intersection. The click of his shutter came rapid fire, each flash lighting up the corridor in stark white bursts that left spots dancing across my vision. That's when I heard it. A voice, low and clear, filling the corridor from no direction I could identify. "Don't let it see you." The words hit me like ice water. The voice carried a weight that made my chest tighten, speaking with the kind of authority that bypassed rational thought and went straight to instinct. I spun around, looking for the source, but the hallway stretched empty in both directions. David lowered his camera, his face lighting up with an excitement that looked wrong in this place. "Did you hear that? Perfect. Absolutely perfect." Before I could ask what he meant, another sound joined the voice, the unmistakable cry of a baby. The sound broke something inside my chest, not because it was unexpected or frightening, but because it was familiar. The pitch, the rhythm, the desperate quality. Everything about it matched memories I'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Isabel in the hospital bed after the accident, machines beeping around her. That same cry cutting through the medical chaos right before. "This is incredible," David muttered, raising his camera again. "I've never gotten audio this clear before." The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent, coming from deeper in the building. Each sob pulled at something in my chest, dragging up images of tiny hands and the way Isabel had looked at me in those final moments. The sound was wrong, impossible, but it reminded me so powerfully of my daughter that my rational mind couldn't hold on to the reasons why it couldn't be real. David's camera flash went off repeatedly, the white light strobing through the corridor as he documented whatever he thought he was capturing. His excitement felt obscene against the sound of the crying, like he was feeding off something that should have demanded respect. "We need to leave," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "Are you kidding? This is exactly what I came here for." David adjusted his camera settings, preparing for more shots. "I knew your photos had captured something special." The baby's cries intensified, and I felt myself taking a step toward the sound before I realized what I was doing. Every instinct screamed that a child needed help, even though every rational thought knew that was impossible. That's when the ceiling above us groaned. I looked up just as a section of plaster and rotted wood gave way. The deteriorated materials came down in a rush of dust and debris, and I threw myself sideways to avoid the largest chunks. My foot caught on a broken floor tile, and I felt myself falling not just down, but through, the weakened floorboards giving way under the impact of the falling ceiling. The world tilted, and I crashed through into empty space. I hit concrete hard, the impact driving all the air from my lungs. Pain shot up my left leg as my ankle twisted under me, and for several seconds, I lay on the cold basement floor, trying to remember how to breathe. Above me, David's voice echoed down through the hole I'd created. "Michael? Jesus, are you okay? Can you hear me?" I tried to respond, but my chest felt like it had been compressed in a vice. The basement around me was darker than the upper floors, lit only by the light filtering down through the opening I'd made and a few gaps in the exterior walls. David's voice came again, more distant now. "I'm going to find another way down. Don't move." But the baby's cries were still there, and they were louder now. The sound came from deeper in the basement, pulling at me with the same magnetic force that had made me step toward it upstairs. Despite the pain in my ankle, despite every logical reason to stay put and wait for help, I found myself pushing up from the concrete floor. The crying was moving away from me, leading deeper into the basement corridors. Each sob felt like a hook in my chest, dragging me forward even as my injured ankle protested every step. My ankle throbbed with each step, but the baby's cries pulled me forward through the basement corridors like a physical force. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the building, echoing off concrete walls that felt different from the deteriorated plaster upstairs. Down here, the structure seemed more solid, more permanent, as if the basement had been built to last while everything above it crumbled away. I pressed my hand against the wall for support, my injured leg refusing to bear my full weight. The crying continued, that desperate infant wail that bypassed every rational thought and went straight to something primal. Each sob reminded me of Isabel in those final days, the way she'd sounded when the pain medications weren't enough, when all the doctors could do was make her comfortable while we waited for the inevitable. The logical part of my mind kept insisting this was impossible. Abandoned hospitals didn't contain crying babies. The sounds had to be coming from somewhere else. Maybe pipes settling, maybe wind through broken windows creating acoustic illusions. But the pitch was too perfect, too human, too familiar. My chest tightened with each cry, dragging up memories I'd spent 3 years trying to bury. I limped around a corner and saw light ahead, not the filtered daylight from the upper floors, but something cleaner, more direct. The basement corridor opened into a small room where gaps in the exterior wall let in natural light that somehow seemed brighter than it should have been given the overcast day outside. That's where I found her. The woman sat in the center of the room, holding an infant against her chest. She wore what might have been a nurse's uniform once, though the fabric looked wrong. Too clean for this place, too white, like it had never been touched by the dust and decay that covered everything else in the building. Her hair hung limp around her face, and when she looked up at me, I saw eyes that were too deep, too hollow, like someone had carved out the sockets and forgotten to fill them properly. "Don't let it see you," she said, in that same voice I'd heard upstairs, the words carrying a weight that made my damaged chest constrict further. The baby in her arms looked real enough. Tiny fingers, soft hair, that red-faced desperation that comes with genuine distress. But something about the scene felt wrong, like watching a photograph that had been slightly out of focus. The woman's movements were too fluid, too graceful for someone holding a squirming infant. She smiled at me then, and I felt my stomach drop. The expression on her face held no warmth, no recognition, nothing that belonged on a human being's features. It was the kind of smile you might see on a doll's face, painted on, permanent, completely disconnected from any actual emotion.
"Don't let it see you," she repeated, her voice never changing tone or inflection. Then she took the baby's arm and twisted it. The snap of breaking bone echoed through the room, sharp and final. The infant's cries intensified, becoming something beyond distress, beyond pain, reaching into frequencies that hurt to hear. The woman's smile never wavered as she adjusted her grip and broke the other arm with the same casual motion someone might use to snap a pencil in half. I tried to move, tried to speak, tried to do something to stop what I was seeing, but my body refused to respond. Every muscle had locked up, leaving me frozen in the doorway while the woman continued her methodical destruction of the child in her arms. "Don't let it see you," she said again, breaking the baby's left leg. The sounds the infant made weren't human anymore. They were something pure and raw, the kind of agony that shouldn't exist in any world that made sense. My chest felt like it was collapsing inward, crushed by the weight of watching something so fundamentally wrong. She broke the right leg next, then started on the ribs, each crack punctuated by her repeated phrase, "Don't let it see you. Don't let it see you. Don't let it see you." "This is incredible." David's voice came from directly beside me, and I jerked my head to find him standing in the doorway like he'd been there the entire time. His camera hung around his neck, and his face showed the same excited expression he'd worn upstairs when he'd heard the initial voice. "Absolutely perfect," he continued, raising his camera toward the woman and the broken thing in her arms. "I've been waiting 2 years to get footage this clear." The click of his shutter filled the room, rapid-fire shots that captured every moment of the horror unfolding in front of us. David's movements were quick and professional, adjusting angles and settings with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "David," I managed to whisper, my voice barely functional. "We have to stop this." He laughed, a sound that carried no humor whatsoever. "Stop it? Are you kidding? This is exactly what I came here for." The woman looked up from her work, those hollow eyes fixing on David with what might have been curiosity. She tilted her head like a bird studying something interesting, and I noticed for the first time that her neck moved too far, rotating beyond what human anatomy should allow. "I've been tracking manifestations like this for 3 years, David said, still taking photos. "Following urban explorers, studying their images, looking for signs of entities that most people can't see. Your photos were perfect bait, Michael. This thing has been attached to you for months." The baby's cries had stopped. The woman held the broken form against her chest, rocking it gently while maintaining that painted-on smile. The silence felt worse than the screaming had. "You're insane," I whispered. "I'm a pioneer," David corrected, lowering his camera to check the images on the display screen. "Do you have any idea how much collectors will pay for authentic supernatural documentation? How much research facilities want this kind of evidence?" He raised the camera again, focusing on the woman's face. "I've been using explorers like you as bait for 2 years. Find someone who's been unknowingly photographing entities, arrange a meeting, follow them to the source, and document everything that happens." The woman stood up, still holding the destroyed infant. Her movements were impossibly smooth, like she was floating rather than walking. She turned toward David with that curious head tilt, and I saw her smile widen to show teeth that were too sharp, too many, arranged in rows like a shark's mouth. "Don't let it see you," she said one final time.
Then she reached out and grabbed David's head with both hands. The sound of his neck breaking was different from the baby's bones, deeper, more final, accompanied by a wet tearing that suggested she'd taken more than just his life. David's camera fell from his hands, hitting the concrete floor with a metallic crash that echoed through the room. She dropped his body next to the camera, then turned toward me with those impossible teeth still visible in her permanent smile. Each step she took in my direction felt like gravity increasing, pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe properly. The room started to darken around the edges of my vision. The woman approached with her arms still cradling the broken infant, her hollow eyes fixed on my face with the kind of attention that suggested she was memorizing every detail. "Don't let it see you," she whispered, so close now that I could smell something like old flowers and antiseptic. The darkness closed in completely, and I felt myself falling backward into nothing. The antiseptic smell hit me before I opened my eyes, sharp and medicinal, nothing like the musty decay of Mercy General. My head felt packed with cotton, and when I tried to shift my position, a dull ache spread up my left leg. The sensation of sheets against my skin felt wrong after whatever had happened in that basement. "Mr. Thompson?" I opened my eyes to find two people in business attire standing beside my hospital bed. The woman had dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore a police badge clipped to her jacket. The man next to her looked older, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of weathered face that came from years of dealing with things most people preferred not to think about. "I'm Detective Sarah Martinez, Detroit Police," the woman said, pulling a small notepad from her pocket. "This is my partner, Detective James Wilson. How are you feeling?" I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. My left leg was encased in a white cast from ankle to mid-calf, and moving sent shooting pains up my spine. The hospital room looked standard. Beige walls, monitors beeping quietly, a window showing gray Detroit sky. "Confused," I managed, my voice coming out rougher than expected. "What happened? How long have I been here?" "You've been unconscious for 2 days," Detective Wilson said, consulting his own notepad. "You were found in the basement of Mercy General Hospital, with severe injuries from what appears to have been a fall through compromised flooring." 2 days. The basement room flashed through my memory. The woman with the infant, David's camera clicking rapidly, the sound of breaking bones. I felt my chest tighten as those images played back in perfect detail. "Mr. Thompson, we need to ask you some questions about David Reed," Detective Martinez continued. "Can you tell us how you knew him?" "David?" The name felt strange in my mouth, like something that belonged to a different person's experience. "He contacted me through my blog, said he wanted to explore together." Detective Wilson leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Thompson, David Reed wasn't an urban explorer. He was a serial killer." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition that David's enthusiasm had never felt quite right. "We've been tracking him for 8 months, Detective Martinez explained. His method was always the same. He'd find urban explorers through online communities, study their work, then contact them, claiming to be a fellow enthusiast. He'd arrange meetings at abandoned locations." She flipped through her notepad, reading from what looked like carefully organized notes. "David Reed is responsible for at least 12 deaths over the past 3 years. All urban explorers. All killed at abandoned sites while he photographed their deaths for his private collection." My mind tried to process this information while images from the basement kept intruding. David raising his camera toward the woman and the broken infant. His excitement as he documented what he thought was supernatural manifestation. The way he'd talked about collectors and research facilities, about using explorers as bait. Your blog and photos were on his computer, Detective Wilson added, along with detailed plans for the Mercy General meeting and evidence linking him to the other victims. He'd been studying your work for months. We followed the digital trail to Mercy General just hours after you fell through that floor, Detective Martinez said. Found you unconscious in the basement and David's body near the main stairwell. Near the stairwell. Not in the basement room where I'd seen the woman break his neck with her impossible hands. They'd found him somewhere else entirely. Building collapse caught him too, Detective Wilson continued. Looks like the same ceiling failure that sent you through the floor caused structural damage throughout that section. David wasn't as lucky as you were. Lucky? I thought about the woman's hollow eyes, the way she'd approached me after dropping David's body, the feeling of darkness closing in around me. Whatever had happened after she'd killed David, whatever had moved his body and left me alive in that basement, the police would never know about any of it.
Mr. Thompson, I want you to understand something, Detective Martinez said, her voice taking on a different tone. By agreeing to meet David at that location, you inadvertently led us to a killer we'd been hunting for months. Your decision to go there probably saved lives. She closed her notepad and looked directly at me. You're a hero, Mr. Thompson. You brought down someone who would have kept killing urban explorers for years. Hero. The word felt absurd given what I'd actually witnessed. I hadn't stopped David Reed. The entity in that basement had done that, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. The police saw a building collapse and a serial killer's bad luck. They had no idea about the woman with too many teeth, about the infant whose bones she'd broken one by one, about the voice that had warned me not to let it see me. Can you walk us through what happened when you arrived at the hospital? Detective Wilson asked, pen ready above his notepad. I told them about David's sports car, his expensive equipment, the way he'd handled my printed photos. I described our movement through the building, the ceiling collapse, my fall through the rotted floor. I kept my account factual and limited to things they could verify, leaving out the voices, the baby's cries, everything that had happened in that basement room. Detective Martinez took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification about timing or David's behavior. Her questions focused on whether David had seemed agitated, whether he'd mentioned other locations, whether he'd said anything that might help them understand his methodology. He talked about following other explorers, I said, which was true enough, about using their photos to find good locations. That matches what we found on his computer, Detective Wilson confirmed. Dozens of Explorer blogs bookmarked, photos downloaded, detailed research on building layouts and access points. They continued questioning me for another 20 minutes, covering David's equipment, his knowledge of the building, anything he might have said about previous explorations. I answered honestly where I could, staying focused on the facts they needed, while keeping the supernatural truth buried. When they finally closed their notepads, Detective Martinez smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from either of them.
The FBI is going to want to talk with you once you're released, she said. David Reed was killing people across multiple states. Your information is going to help close cases that have been cold for years. When can I go home? I asked. Doctor says another day or two for observation, Detective Wilson replied. That was a serious fall you took. You're lucky the injuries weren't worse. Lucky again. I watched them gather their materials and prepare to leave. These two professionals who'd spent months hunting a killer and thought they understood what had happened at Mercy General Hospital. Their explanation made perfect sense. Serial killer, building collapse, investigative breakthrough, clean and logical, no room for impossible women or supernatural intervention. Mr. Thompson, Detective Martinez said from the doorway, I know this has been traumatic, but you should feel proud. David Reed won't hurt anyone else because of what you did." After they left, I lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling tiles and trying to reconcile their version of events with what I'd actually experienced. David Reed, serial killer. 12 victims over 3 years. My photos used as bait to lure me to my death. But the police had no idea what had really killed David, or why I'd survived when he hadn't. They couldn't explain the voice that had warned me, or the entity that had saved me by destroying him. Their investigation would close with David's death marked as accidental, another victim of the urban decay he'd used to hunt others. I closed my eyes and felt exhaustion pull at me, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I heard that baby crying, saw the woman's painted smile, remembered the sound of breaking bones echoing through a basement room that officially didn't contain anything more dangerous than structural damage. The truth was buried in that basement with everything else the police would never find. And for now, that was probably for the best. The cast came off on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Detective Martinez had called me a hero. The doctor in Chicago pronounced my ankle healed well enough for normal walking, though he recommended taking it easy for another month. I thanked him and drove home to my efficiency apartment, officially cleared by Detroit police, and free to return to whatever passed for my normal life. The apartment felt smaller than I remembered, like the walls had moved inward during my absence. Mail sat stacked on my desk, where my neighbor had placed it. Mostly bills and circulars, nothing that couldn't wait. My exploration gear remained exactly where I'd left it before driving to Detroit. Boots lined up by the door, cameras arranged on their shelf, external hard drives containing 20 years of documentation sitting beside my laptop. The phone had been ringing constantly since the story broke. Local news outlets, urban exploration blogs, even a few national programs wanting interviews with the man who'd helped bring down David Reed. I'd let every call go to voicemail, listening to reporters ask for my perspective on the killer who'd targeted explorers, wanting details about our encounter at Mercy General Hospital. I couldn't tell them what really happened. The official story made perfect sense. Serial killer, building collapse, lucky survival. Clean and logical. No room for impossible women with too many teeth or babies whose bones broke with sounds I still heard in quiet moments. The police had their explanation. The families of David's victims had closure. And I had a reputation as someone who'd accidentally led law enforcement to a killer they'd been hunting for months. I opened my laptop and pulled up my photo archives, starting with the Mercy General series from 3 weeks ago. The images looked exactly as I remembered them. Third-floor corridors with peeling paint, broken windows casting shadows across abandoned patient rooms, the intersection where David had spread my printed photos like a treasure map. David had insisted he could see something in these pictures that I'd missed. He'd claimed entities attached themselves to certain explorers, following them through abandoned buildings and appearing in photographs as subtle anomalies most people overlooked. At the time, his theories had sounded like paranormal television nonsense. Now I wasn't so sure. I opened the folder containing my hospital exploration work from the past 5 years. Mercy General, St. Mary's in Cleveland, Providence Hospital, outside Indianapolis, Cook County Hospital in Chicago before it was finally demolished. Hundreds of images documenting empty corridors, abandoned medical equipment, rooms where people had once lived and died. I started with the oldest photos, examining them more carefully than I ever had before. Most showed exactly what I'd intended to capture: architectural details, atmospheric lighting, the way nature reclaimed spaces humans had abandoned. But as I worked through the chronological sequence, I began noticing things I'd previously dismissed as normal photographic artifacts. In a 2019 shot from St. Mary's maternity ward,
A corner shadow seemed too deep for the available light. The darkness had shape to it, almost like a figure standing just outside the frame's edge. I'd attributed it to lens flare or unusual contrast when I'd first processed the image. But now I could see something more deliberate in the way the shadows arranged themselves. A photo from Providence Hospital's pediatric wing showed similar anomalies. The main subject was an overturned wheelchair in a shaft of sunlight, but the background contained shapes that suggested presence without revealing clear forms. Looking at the image now, I could almost make out the outline of someone watching from the abandoned nurses' station. I continued through my archives, finding the same pattern repeated across multiple locations and time periods, always in hospitals, always in areas that had housed the most vulnerable patients: maternity wards, pediatric units, intensive care. The shapes were subtle enough that I'd never noticed them during initial processing, but consistent enough that they couldn't be coincidental. David had been telling the truth about one thing. Something had been following me through my explorations, appearing in photographs I'd taken over the course of years. The entity was real, and it had been documenting itself through my work without my knowledge. But why save me when it had watched David die? The woman in the basement could have killed us both easily, yet she'd chosen to destroy only David while leaving me unconscious, but alive. That suggested intention, purpose, something beyond random supernatural violence. I thought about the baby's cries that had drawn me deeper into Mercy General's basement, how perfectly they'd matched the sound of Isabel in her final days. The woman's repeated phrase, "Don't let it see you," delivered with the same voice that had warned me upstairs. My survival when David's 12 previous victims had all died at abandoned locations. The connection wasn't random. The entity hadn't just killed David to protect itself from his documentation. It had saved me specifically. The baby's cries, the familiar sound that had pulled me toward the basement room, had been designed to lead me to that exact place, at that exact moment. Everything about our encounter felt orchestrated, planned, like the entity had been waiting for David to make contact with me. I opened my Mercy General folder again and found the photo David had examined most closely, the third-floor corridor intersection where shadows met in the corner. Under magnification, the darkness still looked like normal photographic grain to me, but now I understood that David's expensive equipment and training had revealed something my basic approach had missed. The entity had been there, visible in the image, waiting for someone with the right tools and knowledge to recognize its presence. David had spent 2 years tracking manifestations through other explorers' work, using them as bait to document supernatural encounters. But when he'd found my photos, he'd discovered something different. Not just random paranormal activity, but a specific entity that had already chosen its target. Me. I closed the photo and leaned back in my chair, staring at the Chicago skyline through my single window. The late afternoon sun painted the buildings in warm orange light, normal and peaceful. Nothing like the antiseptic brightness I'd seen in that basement room. But even here, surrounded by the familiar comfort of my apartment, I could feel something watching. The entity had spared my life for a reason. David's death hadn't been about stopping his documentation. It had been about eliminating someone who threatened whatever relationship the entity was building with me. The woman with hollow eyes and too many teeth had killed David as efficiently as she'd broken the infant's bones, then arranged my survival to look like lucky coincidence. But it wasn't coincidence. Nothing about my exploring days was coincidental anymore. I understood now that my connection to abandoned places, my need to document forgotten spaces, my draw to hospitals where life and death intersected, none of it had been purely personal choice. The entity had been guiding me toward specific locations, specific moments, building towards something I couldn't yet comprehend. The baby's cries that reminded me of Isabel, the woman's warning voice, my inexplicable survival when trained killers and experienced explorers had died. It all pointed to something personal between me and whatever haunted those abandoned corridors. I closed my laptop and looked out at the darkening sky, knowing my exploring days weren't over. They were just beginning in a way I'd never imagined. The entity had invested years in our relationship, appearing in my photographs, leading me through forgotten places, ultimately saving my life when David threatened to expose what we'd built together. Whatever it wanted from me was just starting.